thank you for coming. We'd just like to ask you, why is there such a heavy emphasis on the ideas of suicide and being gay?
What I'll do is I'll talk about the motivation for writing this book, and that probably will answer your questions. So basically, the reason this book came about was because my partner was working in a Calgary Catholic high school, and because of her sexuality, that couldn't be known, otherwise she'd lose her job. So that was difficult enough for her. But then what happened about the third year into her job was that there was a young man who was 17 and he was 3 months away from graduating, and he committed suicide. And it came out that he actually had been pretty severely harassed, a lot of homophobic bullying going on, and I'm not sure if that's why he took his life, but it certainly was part of the issue there. And what also happened around the same time for her was that there was a young woman who wasn't traditionally feminine, as in she had short hair, she wore guys' clothes, and she liked to skateboard a lot, and a bunch of kids were harassing her, and they took her skateboard and they threw it in the river. And so, these two things were sort of what was happening to my partner at that point. And so what basically happened was when the young man committed suicide, she pretty much hit the wall and decided, this is it, I'm out of here. So she quit her job, she finished the semester, quit her job, decided to quit teaching in high school entirely, and then went on to do more activist work. So she went and did her master's and PhD in education about homophobia in Canadian Catholic schools. And at the same time, I didn't know the guy who committed suicide. I didn't know her school very well, but we talked about it a lot, and it was a huge impact for both of us, because what it meant was one less income in our household, and so we had to think about financial things, and there was also there was a big emotional toll around this. And so for me, the way it came out was that I was working on some sort of project. I was writing something, I don't know what it was, a short story or something, but every time I went to work on that short story, it just seemed so trivial and irrelevant that I just thought, what I should be writing about is the suicide, and the fact that it was a result of homophobic bullying. So that's how I started writing about this and started writing the book. And so basically what happens in the book is that he commits suicide because his heart is broken, and he commits suicide because he's being bullied, and he just kind of gives up. So he doesn't commit suicide because he's gay, but he commits suicide because of various factors that happen to him, and it just becomes this perfect storm where he decides to take his own life.
Why did you choose to use such descriptive sexual language?
Okay, what do you mean?
Using words like slut and what other ones?
There's a long talk about masturbation in the book as well.
I don't know. I don't see it as being overly descriptive. I guess because sex is a part of life, and so if you want to write a realistic book, it would be like cutting out all the dinner scenes. I think, just because it's it's a fact of life. It's true that it happens between closed doors. It's usually more intimate, but it's whether you're having it or not having it, or choose to have it or whatever, it's there no matter what. So I think to not have it and to not use, I think, authentic language would be insincere, like it's part of the picture.
Okay. That's a good explanation. Does the date February 17th have any personal meaning towards you?
No. The only reason I concentrated on that was because I wanted the suicide to be around the same time as Valentine's Day. And so at one point, I think in an early draft of the book, I had the suicide occurring on Valentine's Day or the day after Valentine's Day, or I couldn't figure out what to do. But then I realized, okay, just as far as the mechanics of the plot went, I had to have the suicide had to occur on this day, and there had to be a lag before the students would find out and before the adults would find out, so that my plot could go into effect. And so it just sort of worked out coincidentally that if I put Valentine's Day on Friday, which is also more of a traditional date night, then as far as the school's concerned, nobody at the school would necessarily find out about the suicide until the Monday. And then people like Ginger wouldn't find out until Tuesday, and that helped my plot, of course.
Was there any lessons that you wanted people to learn from reading the book?
That's a question I can't answer, just because basically what it kind of assumes is that I can read my readers' minds and know how they're going to respond to it, and I have no idea. So I think basically the best way to answer that question would be that probably every person reading it will have a different response, and maybe it will be a lesson and they'll learn something, and maybe it will be, I hate this book, and they throw it out the window. They didn't learn a thing, which is okay too.
For sure. Why is sexuality such an important part of identity in the book?
In the book? So what do you mean?
You've chosen to have the characters be very sexual individuals, and we've come to realize in our interpretation of the book that it has a lot to do with the identity of the characters.
So who, like Faraday doesn't have a bit.
So she talks about masturbating, and then Jesus, and getting to like Jesus, and the unicorns are very pure.
Yeah.
Faraday sort of stresses upon herself of sort of drifting away from that sexuality aspect, and she wants to distance herself away from it, but it always seems to sort of circle around the idea of sexuality itself.
I think it partly has to do with in this book, sexuality is so, in some ways, is so overdetermined, right? Where we have for characters like Max and Walter and Ginger and Patrick, they have to hide their sexuality. So it becomes a thing because they have to work so hard on hiding it or denying it or whatever. With a character like Faraday, it just reminds me a lot of when I was in high school, where the big thing was virginity. And what are you going to do with your virginity? And you're going to lose your virginity, and who are you going to lose it with? Maybe you never will, and what if it never happens, and what if it doesn't work, and what if you don't know what you're doing? And so I think with Faraday, she sort of embodies that kind of anxiety that comes around, whether or not to be sexual or not, and the kind of penalty that's associated with that, or the kind of benefits that come with it. So I think all the characters have something going on in terms of their sexuality that they have to think about. With a character like the English teacher, Maureen Lipinski, I think when she was married, she enjoyed a very vibrant sexual life with her husband, but now that they've broken up, she's decided or figured out, well, maybe I'm never going to have sex again, and how is that impacting her understanding of herself as a woman and as a full human being? And the thing about the unicorns is that unicorns are actually not that innocent. So that was the big discovery for me when I was writing this book. And I think this is a question that you have later on, but just to get started on that, I'd always assumed that unicorns, in an early draft of this book, I had unicorn images throughout, but they were Disney images. So they had the eyelashes, they were kind of cartoons, and they were really cute. There were rainbows and stars and things like that. And I showed it to a friend of mine who's an editor, who also has a really strong interest in mythology, and she said, you need to do some research. And so I started doing research, and that's when I found out that unicorns throughout history have had all kinds of really strange, they've symbolized all kinds of things. So there's an example, there's an engraving, I can't remember when it would have been, 1600s, 1500s maybe, by Albrecht Dürer, where it's a picture of Hades, the king of hell, riding a unicorn, right? So, and then there were some things I read where a unicorn traditionally has a flaccid horn, and when it gets aroused, the horn goes up. So it stands in as a kind of, phallus. The other thing too is that the unicorn within, I think, medieval and Renaissance iconography was associated with Jesus Christ in the Passion of the Christ, where the unicorn represents Christ, and then the Virgin who entraps the unicorn is, a stand-in for Mary, or Mary's a stand-in for that Virgin. So the thing about unicorns and sexuality is that the fact of the matter is that that horn is really phallic, and so you kind of ignore that association would be to deny a whole kind of history associated with unicorns. That's not necessarily how I envision my unicorns, but it was definitely part of that. And then what also came out of that as well, when I was doing my research, was I found that there was actually a constellation called Monoceros, which was formulated, I think, around 1642 or something like that. And that was a really, really great kind of coincidence, because, here I was dealing with this book that that had as one of its themes this idea of outer space and the potential of outer space, but then also had the idea of the magic and possibility associated with a figure like the unicorn, and then to have them kind of meet in the middle was a really, really great coincidence. So it became a really wonderful kind of symbol.
How does the pictures in between the chapters in the book, what do they represent? Like at one point, the unicorn is really lively, and then it's like a skeleton version of the unicorn, and all of a sudden on the Tuesday it comes back to life in the picture.
Yeah. Thank you for asking that question, because nobody ever asks that question. And I worked so hard on those engravings, you have no idea. So basically, I guess in the most basic way, the unicorn images represent the images that Faraday has collected. So it's sort of a meta reference to, if you were to go into Faraday's bedroom and look at her unicorn collection, all of these unicorns would be in there. And she would know what they are and where they come from, and their origins. Okay, now why I included them. Part of it was motivation for me as a writer, because I was finding myself really stalled at certain points, and it really helped to just kind of Google around and do research, just go through books and find images of unicorns, just because I was just astounded by the variety of representation, and just how much kind of symbolic baggage was associated with unicorns. So for me as a writer, it was just really useful. But including them in the book, what I wanted to do, and I'm not a graphic artist, but I consider this as my kind of attempt to do a comic book or a graphic novel, which was I wanted there to be a kind of progression in the images, so that they would start out fairly traditionally, like with that very first image, where that unicorn comes from a book of animals, basically. And then as they go, I wanted them to get a little bit weirder and more disturbing, or just plain odd. But it kind of worked out that way. It kind of didn't work out that way, because what I found was the image, for example, of the unicorn and the stag, which I thought was a wonderful kind of confirmation or affirmation that unicorns do exist, and that people did believe that they existed, and maybe some people still do. And then when I found the image of the fossilized, it was basically the Quedlinburg unicorn, the fossilized, the skeleton of the unicorn, what it articulated for me was in a way that Patrick Fury is a unicorn, in that he's special and different and evasive. That's one way of looking at the unicorns. So then having that skeleton there in that kind of Groundhog Day part of the book, where the characters are getting on with their lives, but they're still kind of circling back to that original Monday, it seemed to me that that was the best way to articulate that, was with that repeating image. And then the final image of the walled woman and the unicorn was the very final image I found. And that originally for a long time was just a picture of a narwhal that was going to, I thought, okay, how do I marry the idea of a unicorn with the real world? And so I thought, okay, I'll just get an actual unicorn, so a unicorn in the sea. But it seemed to be such a anticlimax for me. And when I saw that image of the woman with with all the hair all over her body, this kind of wild woman with this unicorn that looks more like a pet dog or a goat than anything else, it it's not Faraday, but it seemed to me to represent, you know, Faraday's relationship, at least her spiritual relationship with unicorns. So I meant there to be a kind of progression in the images, but it kind of, I mean, it's not a smooth progression, that's for sure.
Aside from your partner working in a Catholic school, was there any other reason for the focus on Catholicism?
It was partly because the book could only take place in a Catholic school, and it had to be a Catholic school that was publicly funded. And that's sort of the phenomenon in Canada now, that in Alberta, Ontario, Saskatchewan, and I think one of the places north, those are the only provinces where there is provincial taxpayers' money going towards a separate school system. And what I think is a bit of an injustice around that is that within Catholic schools, especially a Catholic school in Alberta, you can legitimately fire a teacher for being lesbian or gay or transgender, and it happens far too frequently. There's one woman, or former woman, a trans man in Edmonton, for example, who was fired for it. So